Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hope everybody's doing well. We have Max Lenderman with us today. Very, very excited. Before we kick off, a couple of housekeeping items. Number one, Q&A. Please ask. You had the opportunity to submit questions before Polaris today, but if you do have a question during our conversation, please just chat in. I will try to loop them into the conversation if they fit and if we can get to them. Secondly, audio settings. You can configure them on the bottom left of your screen on Zoom. Third, feel free to chime in into the conversation at AnyRoad on Twitter or hashtag Polaris by AnyRoad. And lastly, as Zoom let you know ahead of time, we are recording the session. So we'll send this out to everyone tomorrow, but please know that we are recording. Welcome to Polaris by AnyRoad, a series of interviews with marketing leaders on how to build impactful, lasting relationships with consumers. I'm Daniel Yaffe, Chief Operating Officer here at AnyRoad. For those of you who are less familiar, we were founded in 2012. We're an experiential data platform for brands to scale and optimize customer experiences that change behavior. Companies like Anheuser-Busch, Michaels, Caruso, and Dick's Sporting Goods all count on AnyRoad to capture and analyze all of their experiential records, from activations, appointments, to tours and classes. If your brand is investing in experiential, please check out our website, anyroad.com, or reach out to talk to us. All right, our guest today is Max Lenderman. Max is an experience economy pioneer. He is a leading voice and a vanguard of two massive trends in branding and innovation brand experiences and brand purpose. He has also written 2 books, and he's working on a 3rd one. Max, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yes. Hi, Daniel. Hi, everyone. Hi, I'm Max. Nice to meet you all, my little screens. I've been an experientialist practically my entire career. I got into what is now known as experiential marketing, or in a broader sense, the experience economy, as a journalist. The beginning of my career was as a business journalist, and I was working for a magazine called Beverage World. And my editor comes in into my little cubicle. He's like, you're young. I was, 23, 24 at the time. He's like, you're young. I don't get this. There's a guy in Boston named Jim Cook who wants to take on Anheuser-Busch and Miller Beer. Go interview him. And so I went and interviewed the founder of, Sam Adams, Boston Beer Company.
Nice.
And I started covering the craft beer market at its infancy, basically. And interestingly enough, a lot of the tenets and the building blocks of modern brand building, I witnessed as a journalist covering the craft beer industry, right? Like, whereas the classic brand would have trust through authority, the little beer makers, they were building trust through transparency and authenticity. Instead of creating transactions, they were creating communities. Instead of telling people about what makes their beer better, they were giving it away for free. It was like the earliest freemium policy I've ever seen, like at these beer festivals, right? Like, just drink my beer, and if you want to, buy a six-pack on the way out. And they were opening up their breweries, right, into what now we would consider a brand center or a brand home. Well, this was back in the day, in the mid '90s. So I learned a lot just by observing this kind of nascent industry grow, and not to be overblown, but really take on the giants and win. So I was a journalist, and then I got this opportunity at Web 1.0, the big web rush, to be an editor-in-chief of an online portal for college kids. It was called upath.com. And for our younger viewers, you would not remember this, but back in the day, internet access was actually like $30, $34 a month. Remember, like AOL and Yahoo?
You can pay by the minute, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, exactly right. So we signed a deal with Alta Vista. Gosh, if you
Yeah.
we signed a deal with Alta Vista to provide advertising-based free internet access, 56K. And so, like, you would get this disc, right? This CD-ROM in the mail. Do you remember that, right?
Oh my God, absolutely.
And then every 15 minutes you would get an ad. You would watch the ad, and you get another 15 minutes free. And we thought, wow, great for college kids. And in those days, you weren't able to send CD-ROMs to college college mailboxes. So we had a dilemma. So we decided, hey, why don't we throw parties, right? Why don't we create these like big events and then exit sample these CD-ROMs to college kids? And it was going great until one day, Alta Vista went out of business overnight. Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I remember walking into the office and the phones are ringing, and usually the phones didn't ring that much, and they're just going off the hook, and people are calling like, "Hey, my internet access isn't working." And we're like, "Oh my God, we're kind of out of business, so to speak, right?" Um, and then we were like, what do we do? And so we still had all like 3 or 4 parties lined up. And we had a banner ad advertiser, Dentine Gum, that we called and said, look,
Nice.
we're going out of business. We don't know what to do. And they're like, wait, you still have these parties, right? And we're like, yeah. And the brand manager says, well, I have 50,000 samples of Dentine Gum that I need to do something with. Can you exit sample my gum instead of your CD-ROMs? And we're like, of course, you're going to pay us. And so overnight, we actually became what is now known as an event marketing company,
So funny.
and went from digitally native to really physically, and started an experiential marketing company. And back in those days, the word or the term experiential marketing didn't really exist. And as a former journalist, I decided, hey, I'm going to write a book about this. I want to understand this more. I had a column in a marketing magazine. So I'm like, yeah, I started doing that. And lo and behold, 25 years later, we're talking about this idea of the experience economy. It all started with going out of business because Alta Vista went out of business and Dentine Gum, decided to give us a chance. And
I
so
love it.
it's been quite a journey, but that's where I started from.
I love it. That's awesome. The alcohol piece resonates quite well. I was in the alcohol industry for a long time. Also, kind of traditional marketing, publishing. Wrote a book about whiskey. And during that time, I was in and out of brand experiences all over the world. Right,
Mm.
out in Scotland, cutting peat in the field, and always been this gap. Right, they've been doing it, but it hasn't always had that name. Right, it's so funny you talk about breweries spearheading it. I always picture the Middle Ages. Going to like a local brewery in Germany and like learning how they make it and touching the ingredients, and then you go to the pub and it, and you identify with it. But that's awesome. That's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
Um, Sorry,
No, I
what
was
were you
going to
gonna
say one of the things I
say?
love about it, and I've been, I've for the not detriment for the I've been blessed to work with a lot of spirits brands and a lot of beer
Yeah,
brands, and why I think there's a connection point between spirits and beer brands. And I'm in Boulder, Colorado now, so I consult on some cannabis brands as well as we
well,
talk about progression. But there's a deep sensorial element to the products themselves, and it
yeah.
lends itself to experiences, right? Whether it's an enhancement of an experience or a sensorial element to it, where it just is native to the actual product and the brands themselves to be more experientially minded or experientially forward than some other brands or some other industries.
Totally. Interesting question. I mean, do you think there are some industries that have not touched experiential that absolutely should dive into experiential?
Yes, I mean, I subscribe to an axiom of the more digital, the more physical, right? And
Mhm.
and it's pretty much kind of rooted in human psychology, anthropology, almost existentialism to a certain extent,
Right.
where the more kind of automated things get in our lives, the more
Hmm.
we seek out experiences, fresh experiences, emotional experiences. The more things become ones and zeros and shiny kind of screens, the more we want some edges. We want some
Yeah, yeah.
roughness. We want some, emotional kind of muscle building. And so I see a huge opportunity for technology
Hmm.
as it grows, as it becomes more and more pervasive, for tech brands, if you want to call it, to become a lot more experientially minded as well, to fill that gap, to be the yin to the tech yang. And if you kind of fast forward and where my head is going these days, and I've been diving into some rabbit holes, but this whole notion of the metaverse,
Yeah.
and what is happening in that in Web 3. We started this
Mm.
conversation. I got into the experiential with Web 1. What's happening
Yeah.
with Web 3 is a huge opportunity for experiential minded folks and marketers. Not only just from the fact that these communities that are being built in the digital ecosystem are going to need to have IRL experiences, meetups, etc. But just also the notion that, like, again, the more physical or the more digital, the more physical, there's going to be a dimensionalization that needs to occur for tech brands that has
Hmm.
to occur in the real world. It has to occur
Totally.
in things off the screen. So I think that sector is massively
Interesting.
underserved from an experience economy perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think about Google, right?
Mm.
Google, for the longest time, it was only virtual experiences, only digital experiences. And now they're investing in stores. I think they've started to open up their first stores in New York so that you can actually touch, experience Google, talk to somebody. I mean, mimicking what Apple's doing probably, and has been very successful at. That's super interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
I would also offer to say, Salesforce and what they do with Dreamforce, and you're a San Francisco native. They've been
yeah,
shutting down blocks of San Francisco every year in order to
totally.
bring their people together, in order to bring their customers together, because they find so much value in that human connection that they're creating.
Oh, 100%, 100%. Let's talk about measurement for a second. So we as an organization exist because we've seen this gap, right? When I was out in Lafroy cutting peat in the field, all they cared about was, I was one person, I paid 10 pounds, and that's about it. We realize there's a huge gap in the industry when it comes to branded experiences, that most brands are doing it by the seat of their pants. They do it because intuition drives it. They call it different things. I'm curious your perspective from the agency side. Do agencies want this data? Are there agencies that are a little bit allergic to it because they're worried it's going to show that some things aren't working?
Uh, Short answer is yes. There are a number of what I would call experiential marketing agencies that are drastically holding on to old measurement metrics. And those measurement metrics are things like, eyeballs, or,
Yeah,
how many
totally.
people walk through something, or
Totally. Totally.
I've heard measurement. I've heard things in pitches and in recap meetings about counting smiles, right? So that, like, like an event or something, an experience happens, and the recap is like, oh yeah, like everyone was happy and everyone's smiling. It's a success.
Yeah.
Right. And a ton of the measurement that I think some of the more legacy driven experiential marketing agencies are doing are measuring the actual experience itself. They're not creating, it's almost an immediate measurement. And they have
Yeah.
a really hard time creating a halo effect measurement, more three-dimensional measurement, if you will, in terms of what happened 3 days later, or 3 months later, or 3 years later, and expanding that kind of like halo effect of that experience. And similarly, in the same vein, they are not doing a great job in kind of with the insight piece of actually
Yeah.
creating insight that actually leads to the experience itself. Like, what are we trying to accomplish beyond brand awareness or brand affinity, or some kind of audience centric KPI? What is the human value of this experience, and how do we measure that? How do we input that human value into the experience, and how do we measure the output of that human value afterwards? And I suspect that for a lot of agencies, measurement could be a little bit scary to them because of the size of the budgets and the complexity of the projects. That if a more kind of modern client like really started looking under the hood beyond just the audience metrics, beyond the smile metrics, so to speak, and really started looking at the long tail, the long term effects of these experiences, they might be asking some harder questions that some agencies don't want to answer.
Totally. No, I love that you talked about the halo effect and three-dimensional. We actually have this framework we talk about here at AnyRoad, which is one-dimensional metrics and three-dimensional metrics from
Hmm.
experiences, right? One-dimensional metrics is how many people went to this event, right?
Hmm.
Maybe even like how many items did you sell at that event? Important directional data, but three-dimensional data is that impact data.
Yeah.
And the term halo, I think that resonates with people. I personally kind of hate that word because it insinuates that it's not intentional,
Oh.
right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Like halo to me is something that like, hey, it comes with it's the glow. Whereas if you think about it as three-dimensional, well, that is the point. If you think
Yeah.
about, well, could you measure this? And like that is the whole point of our experiential strategy, is creating that impact. It's super interesting.
Yeah, and and I see that now, like the non-intentionality of a halo effect, right? Or
Totally,
marketing and
totally.
whatnot. I could totally see that, but it
Yeah.
it also speaks to this notion of there's the experience economy is really becoming a lot more complex, dynamic,
Hmm. Hmm.
dimensional. It's really kind of come into its own beyond events, sampling, brand ambassadors, ride and drives, that kind of like tactical
Totally.
kind of connotation of what experiential is. Experiential is now really encompassing so many different verticals in a brand, right? Like I read somewhere an agency, I forgot the name of them, but they had a line that says, "The experience is the brand," right? So
Hmm.
you're not really kind of creating a quote unquote brand experience. You're building a
Yeah,
brand through experience at every single
I love
touch
that.
point, right? And so you have to bring in these elements in order to get a holistic picture of what that experience means to people. Um,
100%.
and right now, like like we talk about experiences, and to a certain extent, a lot of experiences like are still in this kind of like memorable bucket, where they're like,
Hmm. Hmm.
"Hey, was it a memorable experience? Great, we're done."
Cool.
Right? Right? That's cool. That's
Totally.
all that's all that happens. You remember the brand, you went to Coachella, you hung out at the
Right,
tent, you
right.
remember it, maybe like, but we're getting to a place where because the ecosystem, a brand experience ecosystem is so much larger, you start thinking about, is this a meaningful experience, right?
Right.
And it takes it to another level in terms of how to measure meaning, right? And so
Yeah.
something memorable might evoke an emotion, and you're like, Google, check the box. Something meaningful evokes an emotional that has a personal insight attached to it. Something happens to you,
Totally.
right? You think
Totally.
about something differently, and you start going like, how do I measure that? How do I start measuring meaning? How do I start measuring personal insight? Again,
Hmm.
beyond just the memory trigger of
Yeah.
experience, but something even deeper.
I love that. One thing, one dimensionality that we think with that is the context of who these consumers are.
Mm.
Because you and I can both go to something, an experience, maybe it's an experience within Coachella, just to run with that example. And we might be two very different consumers, and it impacts us in two different ways. And I think a lot of brands actually miss that. They think that all consumers who are coming love their brand or are new to the brand, and they don't realize that, you might be an avid Coca-Cola drinker and I don't drink Coke at all. And
Right.
so our experience of the brand might be completely different. And
Yeah.
it's one of these things, the era of personalization, I think a lot of brands need to start thinking about a lot.
Agreed. The idea of mass customization or or scaled personalization
Yeah.
is a big deal. Like, I use the term a lot of empathy at scale, right? Like
Yeah.
that
Cool.
that you need to flex empathy muscles, and that word is now in like all business publications. You read Harvard Business Review or
Yeah.
Forbes or Business Insider, everyone's talking about the need for empathy, and I think it's connected to CX a lot as well. Is like, how
Mhm.
do you create multiple
Totally.
viewpoints about human beings rather than demographical or psychographical, kind of like standards or buckets, so to speak. And I think
Totally.
context is everything. We started talking a little bit about spirits and beer, etc. For years, and I couldn't imagine this, but like for years, the industry of creating experiences for spirits or beer was based on like three verticals, maybe four, like on premise, off
Yeah.
premise, travel, and now like maybe five,
Yeah.
10 years ago they started to call it home premise or whatnot. And that
Right.
was
Right.
it.
Right.
Like, you designed for the location, like you designed for the that, and you weren't designing for people, for occasions, right?
Yeah.
Like for mindsets, for need
Totally.
states.
Totally. Yeah.
And a lot of like really great ideas die on the vine when you put it through a really narrow filter, like,
Hmm.
well, this is an on-premise thing and we do on-premise this way, right? Rather
Right.
than
Right. Right.
maybe opening up the aperture from an empathetic perspective and a need state perspective of like, what can we do to serve different various customers at different need states at different times of the day?
Totally.
And
Totally.
really get down to that as a way to start understanding people, rather than just saying everyone that comes into a liquor store wants to buy, our bottle, versus, do
Right. Right.
they,
Right.
right? Do they really?
Yeah. Right. How do they feel about it? Interesting. I think we're at an interesting point now because experiential as a stated industry or as a stated trend has now been around for a while. right? It's, I think for many years, people were like, what is experiential? What is experiential? And helping to define it. And now maybe there's a moment, especially after COVID, which we'll talk about as well, to look backwards. And I'm curious, I mean, you've been through it. You've been seeing it adapt and change. I'm curious how you've seen it change over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, when I first kind of got into the industry, and what excited me the most was this ability to that, or this notion that experiences could help people, right? Or could give them, you know, a sense of levity from their everyday, could give them a solution to a problem, could give them inspiration to, you know, an existential malaise, like things that can bring a more of a, I don't want to say the word spiritual, but really more human
Yeah.
element to the human condition, right? Like, you know, something like that. And it's moved in the past 10, 15, 20 years into more tactics, right? Like
Right.
pop-ups and sampling and ride and drives and, you know, 20 by 20 tents at festivals, etc. And I'm seeing a shift back a little bit. And I think it's because
Mhm.
this notion of purpose and brand purpose has really started to come to the fore in the past 5 years, 7, 8 years, where the idea that experiences should have a sense of utility to them, right? That they
Mhm.
shouldn't detract or distract people from their lives, but really become more of like a solution based thing, that makes life easier or makes inspiration more graspable,
Mhm.
makes memories more rich. And I really love that that's where it could be going, right? Is that there's not just the memorable piece of it, not just the emotional piece to it, but really a utility component to it. Some sort of thing where you're not just bearing witness to event, but you're creating an opportunity for someone to transform, right? And I think that
Yeah.
there's a trend or a term, and I'm not the one who is coming up with it, but you know, Joe Pine and James Gilmore, the guys who wrote the Experience Economy, they're seeing the progression, the economic progression from, you know, commodities to goods to services to experiences. That the next level is going to be transformation, right? Is this ability to
Mhm.
get people to actually fulfill their purpose, whatever that may be,
Yeah.
to solve a problem, to scratch an itch for them, and have guided experiences along the way. So it's not just one experience that solves everything, but through a continuum of time, cohesive experiences that a brand can provide in order to provide some kind of personal transformation in people.
I love
And I
that.
think that is a massive opportunity, a huge opportunity, to start
Huge.
thinking about brand experience in more transformative ways than just memorable or, you know, emotional ones.
I love that. I can think off the cuff of, I do, you know, what companies are doing right now. You think about like Home Depot, people want to become more DIY. That is a purpose, that it's not just a utility, a moment in time, but it's a journey, and they're a partner in that. Or we work with Michael's Arts and Craft Stores. Same thing, right? You want to be a crafter or maker. Well, they're with you on that journey.
Correct. Empowerment, right? Is this the sense of, and
Yeah,
it's almost like a guide, like a personal coach, right? It's and
I
you know,
love it.
like I just came up with the metaphor, but it's like, so you want to lose weight, and traditional experiential marketing would be like, all right, join a gym, right?
Yeah,
But the real way to do it is a mind shift, like, you know, thinking
yeah,
about health, right? So it's like
yeah,
purpose
yeah, yeah.
is forward thinking, right? So there's this opportunity for brands to
Totally.
really get into guided transformations rather than, you know, static experiences. And I think that's, in order to have that to occur, I think the kind of the amount of experiences that you need to provide and the cohesiveness of those experiences are going to become much more complex,
Yeah,
than just, you know, spending a couple $100,000 for a footprint at a music festival. I think it's
totally.
going to get a lot more interesting in where you can create those transformative experiences pretty much anywhere in the world at any time. And
Yeah,
that's where I
exactly.
think measurement really comes into play, because you're not
Totally.
really fixated on a certain location at a specific point in time, but you're really taking a look at everything and everywhere and all the time, and
Yeah,
creating the connective
I love it.
tissue between those.
and iterating. This is a whole other conversation
Mm.
that we could get into. But I think a lot of brands have poured money into sponsorships, to experiences, and they craft it and they craft it and they work with agencies. They launch it and then they get the report of how many smiles back.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we're seeing and using our software is iterating, being able to A/B test. Right, you would never spend $500,000 on a Facebook campaign and say, I think it's going to work. Good luck. No, you iterate it. You do A/B testing and figure out what's working and what's not. Uh, I, obviously the kind of elephant, hopefully on the way out of the room, is COVID. I'm curious. So again, experiential as an industry or as a trend has been growing. We know budgets are pouring more and more into it, and we believe as people measure it, it's going to even increase. And then COVID happens. I'm curious, what have you seen? But also really looking ahead, how do you think that's going to really affect experiential in the next chapter?
Yeah, I think so. A few things. The first is that experiential marketers, and I think marketers in general, if you want to talk about it, is that they have to understand and they have to kind of almost internalize that there is no going back. There's not going to be a normal, right? Or what used to be. Like it's fundamentally changed. And I think it's because human beings have fundamentally changed, right? There's been some kind of transformative thing in our psyche, collective cultural psyche, that COVID has instilled in us. And again, I hearken back to Joe Pine and James Gilmore when they talk about the notion of time, right? Where they basically say like consumer service or customer service is time well saved, customer experiences is time well spent, and transformative experiences is time well invested. And I think what humans and for us in North America in particular, we have a much deeper sense of what to do with our time, and what is worth our time, right? What experiences are worth our time has been fundamentally shifted. And I hate to say that it's been shifted because there's been an existential crisis that was thrown into our face where there has been death, right? And at the same time and how we spend it, where from working from home or not getting on an airplane, or those things have fundamentally shifted. Like our sense of continuum,
Mm-hmm.
has radically changed. And I think you have to understand that as an experiential marketer, that the experiences that you need to create right now have to be worth people's time, right? And have to be
Yeah.
kind of specific to the existential change that has occurred with us. And I think this notion of transformation, we've in 4 months we've adopted digital technology. We've doubled our adoption of digital technology that took 10 years,
It's
right?
crazy.
And so like so there we've already been transformed. We've already been
Mm-hmm.
transformed as a society, as a culture. And to negate that or disqualify that as a massive shift in how we market and how we create experiences for people is just asinine. So
Yeah.
understanding that what COVID has done is transformed our perception of time and what's worth it, and we have to be mindful of that.
I love that. I love it. I was talking to a friend at an agency recently who was saying we used to just do events and have free drinks and people would show up, right? And I think that's a perfect example. Like that might
Mhm.
not fly anymore. I think all of us are rethinking our time and who we spend time with. It's a much deeper choice than which brands to spend time with. But I think that's you're spot on.
100%. And look, I'll give you a small example. There's a campaign that an agency did called Superfly in New York, and they did it for Clear. And they basically, it was after lockdown, what they did was they Clear has a product that basically is like a health pass, right? And then they
Mhm.
partnered with United because Clear is a kind of like a travel brand,
Yeah.
and they brought families together that were separated for months on end, and they
Uh,
did it at Giant Stadium or Meadowlands, whatever it's called
uh,
these
uh, uh.
days, right? And all the press showed up, right? Because they were bearing witness to humans coming together for the
Awesome.
first time, right? And without COVID, you would never be able to have
Right.
that emotional transformational experience for people. And so it's a small example, and it sucks that COVID, occurred in order to have that kind of a human
Totally.
emotional kind of experience. But at the same time, it just shows that there's a power in harnessing the human emotional experience that COVID is that has given us. It's, everything that's bad, not to psychobabble, like makes us better, right? And
Yeah.
so we can't not negate what has happened that's bad to create opportunities for better experiences, better transformative experiences for people.
That's such a great example. I want to switch gears a little bit. In your second book, Brand New World, you looked
Mm.
at experiential in the BRIC countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, and China. I'm really curious. I mean, you know, they're things have changed a lot over this last couple of years. I mean, some of them are no longer developing countries, but I'm curious how experiential is different there. Are they in a different phase or in a different chapter, or culturally is it completely different? I'm curious what you've seen.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest shift is, or the biggest kind of difference is that those countries, particularly Russia, India, and China, um, didn't have the luxury of 40 plus years of above the line traditional media, right? Didn't have
Mm,
the luxury of television, like saturation, print, out of
really?
home, et cetera. Like, during the communist days in Russia, like it was one channel and there was, like that was
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
there
yeah.
were no
Totally.
brands. Um,
Yeah.
for instance, in India, one of the ways they when I was there, and this was what 7 8 years ago, maybe even longer. Um, there's a whole population base, 600 million people that don't get
Mhm,
television or radio,
mhm, mhm,
right? And
mhm,
so, how do you market a cell phone
mhm,
to
mhm.
someone who can't see commercials? And what they did is they
Totally.
hired actors that travel around the country in these like trucks, and they'd open up and do a stage, and they actually act out
That's
the
cool.
commercials,
Yeah,
right?
it's
So
awesome.
talk about experiential, right? But it's such an
It's awesome.
interesting component of like to physically act out something that an agency created and put on television.
Yeah.
You know, in Sao Paulo, they got rid of all out of home advertising when I was there, right? And that's why I went
Oh
there,
wow.
like, all out of home, because they were talking about mental pollution, right, as a health threat to human
Oh my
beings,
God.
right? And so there's so many different kind of cultural nuances, that, for instance, in China, you can get a knockoff of anything, right? Like anything
Right.
can be knocked off. So what's the
Right. Right.
value of a brand? If
Mm,
if anything could be knocked off, what do you do to create brand value if a typical person doesn't know if it's a knockoff or not, right? So you
right.
can't
Right.
knock off experiences, right?
Yeah.
Those
Interesting.
are actually fundamental and authentic. So there's just this whole world out there that doesn't have the same foundational bedrock of
Yeah.
above the line media, that are inventing completely new ways of doing things.
That's awesome. That reminds me of that whole mechanism in experiential. It's pull versus push. You're not pushing this media into people's lives. You're saying, come get it. Right. It's going to bring
Correct.
that value to you. That's
Correct.
awesome.
They don't have passive, like, we've had 40 years of media has turned a lot of us as consumers into passive consumers, and I think experiential is changing that dynamic. The experience economy is taking millions of passive consumers into fans, into
Yeah.
engaged consumers, and that's why when you read something like Edelman Trust Barometer, like, we wouldn't care if 95% of brands disappeared, because
Yeah.
95% of brands don't evoke the emotional connections that we had with the five brands that we're fans of.
Yeah. That's huge. That's huge. I believe it or not, we only have like 7 minutes left. So I'd love to ask like one or two more questions and then get into some questions that folks are submitting. And if you're watching and you have a question that's come up, please chat that in now, and we'll try to loop that in. But I'm interested in getting your insights into what the experience economy will look like in the next 10 years, and maybe even a sneak peek into your predictions that you're writing into your next book.
Yeah, I think there's something here about the amalgamation of brand purpose and brand experience, right? Like this idea that, the next iteration of the experience economy is going to be centered around deep utility. And I was reading reports that basically trust in government organizations and trust in non-government organizations is at an all-time low, but trust in some of the brands like Nike, Tesla, Patagonia, and Ben and Jerry's are an all-time high, right? So
Yeah.
there's this cultural kind of shift that's going into like, hey, can the collective power of commerce, of capitalism, of brand building, can it be directed towards helping people, helping society, helping right some wrongs, etc.? And I think the answer is fundamentally yes. And this kind of amalgamation between purpose and experience and what a brand's role in culture is and how it's going to be rewarded for its role in culture is really, really interesting. And when you combine it with, as we talked a little bit about, this Web3 notion of decentralized autonomous organizations and how communities are being formed without the paywalls and firewalls of a Facebook or an Instagram or a Twitter,
Totally.
and
Totally.
how brands can play in creating experiences within these decentralized autonomous organizations, then it becomes really interesting in terms of what can be invented, in
Yeah.
terms of what a brand experience could look like. And the sky's the limit because we're just scratching that surface. So this notion of purpose and metaverse, right? Purpoverse. I just made that up, but whatever. It sounds
Purpoverse.
terrible. Purpoverse is really, really interesting to me.
That's awesome. Cool. There's some questions coming in from some of our audience. This one's from Shannon Fletcher over at Six Speed. Any tips on working with legacy brands, getting those clients to evolve what experiential means, pairing future-focused ideas with legacy storytelling? I think that's a really good one. Comes up in our world a lot as well.
It's a great one, and I think the one thing as a former creative director and an agency owner, what you try to kind of instill is confidence in being courageous. I think that's the first thing, right? Is how do you instill or give credence to, like, let's try something new. And I think
Mhm.
it doesn't come overnight. I think it happens through metrics, KPIs, measurement, A/B testing, all those things
Totally.
that can create a sense of comfort in the new. Um,
Mhm.
and um, and then the other thing is, I always think about is, like, there's a richness of storytelling that are in the troves of legacy brands. There are massive opportunities to excavate and illuminate things that
Mhm.
the brand or the company has done in the past that are totally relevant to the present, if not the future. And how do you story tell that in really modern, dynamic ways? And everyone has them, right? And
Mhm.
there's a company out of DC called what do they call it? Like the history book or something like that, where they basically create content. They go into archives and they extract personal stories, letters that people sent to the company, like kids sending a letter asking for bubble
That's
gum or
cool.
whatnot, right? And then they create really compelling stories and campaigns
That's awesome.
around those things that happened in the past. So I think there's richness. If there's richness in that legacy, there's a story to be told. And I think brand centers can do that as well, right? I think great lobbies, right, can do that as well. I
Mhm.
think
Mhm.
great
Mhm.
advertising, we haven't even talked about this, but the experiential marketing we've talked about so far is consumer facing, but there's a whole
Yeah.
richness in creating experiential advertising from an internal standpoint of educating, inspiring, and in creating advocates from employees, right? And
Totally.
inspiring them with histories that are internally facing as well, and activating that. How do you activate that? And so I
Absolutely.
always think that it's like, if you have a story to tell, and if you've been around for more than 20 years, I guarantee you there's 1,000 stories you can tell and create.
Awesome.
So I think I think that's where you have to go, is be courageous in being forward facing, but also being inspired by the legacy and the stories that you can harvest in order to be that courageous forward facing brand.
Yeah, I completely agree. This one's from Priscilla Tate. I think this was a more of a clarifying question of, she said, well, would be interested to know more about brand experience. What kinds of activities lead to brand experience? I think if I'm answering this correctly, Priscilla, we're talking about brand experience a lot, right? Like, maybe why are we talking about brand experience? How does that differ from experiential marketing? Curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I would look at it as experiential marketing is, think of it as more tactically based,
Hmm.
but brand experience is more strategically based. And there's interplay, right? But I think experiential marketing as a term is growing up and encompassing a lot more than just kind of like the tactics of creating experiences. And I think brand experience is everything, right? So when I start thinking about brand experience, I start thinking about CX. And when I start thinking about CX, I don't just think about customer experience. I think about stakeholder experience. I think about ownership experience. I think about user
Oh,
experience. I think about CX as everything: community, culture, and customer. And so, how does your brand
mhm.
show up in community, culture, and customer? That's your brand experience. It's everything. And so, experiential marketing is a part of that. But I think brand experience is the brand.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. We're just about out of time, but I do want to ask you one more, and maybe we can end on this note. We at AnyRoad think about brand's relationship with experiential on a maturity model, right? There are the brands out there that don't know they're supposed to be doing experiences. They're new to it. Maybe they are those legacy brands. And then, the brands that realize they should be doing it, but that's kind of where it stops. And then
Mm.
the brands that are doing it are like, oh, we probably should be measuring it, but one-dimensional metrics. And then really like it gets to this place where brands know they should be doing it. They're measuring, they're tying it to lifetime value or lifts in brand perception, maybe looking at bringing meaning to people's lives. I ask you this: if there's a brand that's listening today or that you're engaging with that's really early on in that maturity scale, what advice do you have?
Do it, because you won't be in existence for long if you don't. If you can't capitalize, if you can't identify and capitalize on, to use a Simon Sinek, trope, on why you matter to people, and you can't, fundamentally explain that in memorable, meaningful ways, you're in trouble. So I would venture to say that, especially if you start looking at the next generation of your customers, right? And you start looking at the studies that are out there in terms of how much they value experiences over materialistic things, then you will soon find out, like almost immediately, that if you're not crafting experiences for them, you are absolutely irrelevant in their lives. And that's it. Like if you're irrelevant in people's lives, then it's going to be a really, really hard slog to try to win that relevancy back. So I think it's really important that the experiential, the brand experience component of your strategy is well defined, well measured, and activatable at multiple touch points. And so that you're not just siloing it as a promotion or as a sponsorship activation, but it's you understand what your brand means to people in almost every single touch point, and you're creating meaningful, memorable experiences at those touch points as much as you possibly can.
That's huge. Can you think of brands that have died out because they didn't start to iterate with experiences?
Yeah, look at Sports Authority versus Dick's. Like, like in Dick's is a client, obviously, of yours. I didn't
Yeah,
know
yeah,
that
yeah,
until
yeah,
you
yeah.
introduced it. But
Yeah,
Dick's has gone into experiential and experiential retail in a
so
big way. Sports Authority is dead in the water. I was thinking the other day of
yeah,
Planet Hollywood. Remember like
yeah,
Planet Hollywood was like everywhere, like at every single
yeah,
thing, and
yeah,
it just went away. And
yeah,
because they didn't iterate, to your point, they
yeah.
didn't iterate their experience. They latched on to an old meaning of an experience, which is, hey, we got some cool like furniture or some cool like they
Yeah,
didn't iterate into other ways of becoming a more experientialized brand. And I think that like more and more brands who are finding out, like I look at Bumble,
yeah,
for instance, as
yeah.
a great success story in terms of dimensionalizing their experience. It starts out as a dating app, and now you're seeing them pop up at festivals. You're seeing them creating a
Awesome.
cafe, like, and they're creating coffee shops. They're doing great
Totally.
partnerships. They're dimensionalizing their brand in the real world in really interesting ways. And if so, like a competitor like Match or what's the Tinder, if they're not doing
Yeah,
those things, then you're going to see leadership status from Bumble, across the board. Movie theaters. I think movie COVID has shown movie theaters to be kind
yeah.
of becoming irrelevant.
Right,
And
right.
so, and you see like drive-throughs are coming back, or like really interesting
Totally,
ways.
totally.
So if movie theaters don't iterate and evolve like the way the Alamo Drafthouse is kind of
Right,
evolving
right, right,
an
right.
experience, they're going to be in trouble soon too. Not just because of Netflix
That's
and
awesome.
Amazon Prime, but because of the experience and the value of time well spent that they might not be providing anymore.
It's a huge opportunity for them as well.
Yeah, Agreed.
Max, thank you so much for the time today. I realize we're a few minutes over, but we really, really appreciate it. Thank you to all of you who joined, and we will follow up soon. Have a
Awesome.
wonderful day.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers. Take care. Thank you. Bye.